no fuma. Awe mese bi ati bona fofo. Mawa tulungene nuwa o. Nabanyo, I ne ma fuma. Nobodo ibo, I ne ma fuma. Ifeni ni boneme, na fa ne ma fuma. O ibo do, na ibo fu.
Welcome once again to Ńkàtá Ụmụ-Ìgbò, the June edition. As always, we try to provide through this distinguished speaker series a platform for very distinguished persons in ala Igbo. Ndị Igbo ji wee bilu, ndị Igbo ji wee kwudo. We try to invite them to give them a platform to lead conversations around development, issues of development, as it concerns the region. And finally, the evening, closes with the dialogue, which is the Ńkàtá itself, where participants, guests, you and I, can ask questions and gain clarity. So once again, I warmly welcome you, and I will welcome, before I welcome the Executive Director of the Center, Maazị Ihani Igboko, I want to recognize very special, guests in the room. There is Chief Ben Etiaba, and for every Ńkàtá, I look forward to, I can close my eyes without even looking in his direction. I'm almost certain that he's in the room. Chief Ben has been a solid supporter of this speaker series, and he has shown his solidarity with what we do at the CFM through various ways. Many of you know that years ago, we used to have Ńkàtá at the sports club, and it was, through our relationship with him that we had the opportunity of holding Ńkàtá for many years, while he was the chairman of the sports club at, GRA, and we're immensely grateful and mindful of that. Chief, thank you so much and welcome once again. There are people I do not know their names, but I'm sure Mr. Ihani Igboko, when he comes on stage, will acknowledge their presence. And of course, the students who always join us in good time also. They were here for the mentorship session, which typically precedes the Ńkàtá series. So once again, I welcome everyone in the room, students who have come from tertiary institutions. I can see a titled man in the building, but I'm sure he will also be duly welcomed when he takes the stage as the moderator of the panel session. No, Onya Obona, welcome to the center and welcome to Ńkàtá June edition. Mr. Hani, please, it's a cue.
Ndebanye kene muno. Na fandi Center for Memories gaiji anabata Onya Obona. I can never preach our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Chima Korieh, who for many months we've been trying to get him to do this, and on our try this arrangement, and even as he has accepted to speak, it wasn't the best of times for him. He's bereaved. He lost his mother, and the burial is happening in 6 days. But in spite of all of this, he still deemed it necessary to have this conversation. Prof, Ainekenegi Ebo Diuku. And like Angole mentioned, at the Center for Memories, what we try to do is to document the history, culture, and excellence of Ndị Igbo. And on the Emeka, Nyime, Otutu, Inye, Genyeru Ndị Igbo, Aka, Iwata, Ndị Anyị Igbo, and Ebe Anyị Na-eje. And this June, we have a lot of activities at the Center for Memories. In fact, from the 16th, we are participating in an exhibition in London, London Design Biennale, where we are telling the story of the Ledger archaeological site, which happens to be one of the oldest Iron Age smelting sites around the world. And a lot of people do not know about it. And so we have collaborating with the Nigerian Pavilion to tell this story in London. For those who may not be in London, we're screening here on the 14th, so that you'll be in tune with the story and innovation and technology. Some of us do think it's a Western idea, but also we have our own inventions and innovation around here. I would love to see a lot of people attend that particular event. This June again, we are doing the Things Fall Apart Festival. It's a week-long festival that will bring all the literary community, cultural custodians here na Enugu. Our headline speaker is Chima Ngozi Adichie. She'll be here in Enugu. And most people do not know that the Ajofia Newi masquerade, was created out of Things Fall Apart. And he will be here as well, to perform his poetry. So we are cooking a lot of, great and important meal for Ndebanye. And the good thing is that we have a lot of people who are coming from far and near to be part of this festival. Ka Ndebanye, on a Center for Memories, join in. And to crown it all, we are doing a global reading marathon where we expect people to read their favorite passage of the work in 2-3, minutes. We have received quite a number of, readings from across the world. And for secondary school and a writing competition, so we have a team already. So open a school the topic. I think our people will share it, with you. And you can follow us on social media to get an idea of other things the Center for Memories name. So maybe I only said I will say a few thank yous, but I think that will be done appropriately by the end of today's session. I know we came to listen to Professor Chima Korieh, and I enjoin everybody to sit well, relax, and be ready to participate in the next session. So thank you, and welcome to Ńkàtá.
Igbo mmanụ ndewonu ndị Igbo na-asị na ọkụ agụnye nwatakịrị n'aka ada ere ya. So I've been given a task, a very big one that I don't even feel worthy enough to perform, but just like I said, ọkụ agụnye nwatakịrị n'aka ada ere ya. So I'm going to be introducing our distinguished speaker for this evening. I'm going to be reading out his bio and, a brief introduction of what he's going to be speaking on tonight. So we have Professor Chima J. Korieh as our distinguished speaker for the June edition of our monthly distinguished speaker series, Ńkàtá Ụmụ-Ìgbò. And Professor Chima J. Korieh is not just a distinguished historian and scholar. He specializes in West African social and economic history with a focus on the 19th and 20th centuries, gender relations, and comparative slavery. Professor Chima was born in 1962 in Mbise, Imo State, Nigeria, and earned a first-class honors degree in history and education from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And then he went on to acquire a lot of other advanced degrees, including a PhD in African history from the University of Toronto. Professor Korieh has held different academic positions across Africa, North America, and Europe as well, including teaching roles at the University of Toronto, University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and currently he's the Director of Africana Studies at Marquette University in Milwaukee, United States. Professor Chima Korieh is the former president of the Igbo Studies Association and the founding editor of the Igbo Studies Review. His research explores the themes of colonialism, imperialism, African diaspora history, as well as the socioeconomic transformations in West Africa. He has also published so many notable works, including The Land Has Changed, History, Society, and Gender in Colonial Eastern Nigeria. Professor Chima Korieh has also received several awards and recognitions, including the Rockefeller Foundation African Dissertation Internship Award, a British Academy Fellowship at Oxford University, and the Thabo Mbeki Award for Research Leadership. And today, we have Professor Chima Korieh speaking on the topic, Igbo Ga-Adị, reclaiming the Igbo blueprint in the cultural and political evolution of sub-Saharan Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, with a resounding round of applause, please let's warmly welcome Professor Chima Korieh.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to Enugu, to the Center for Memories. So it's exciting to be here. I have had a good time since yesterday. It was a great opportunity to also meet some students who, this afternoon, who in many ways got me to think about things I have forgotten for a long time. So thank you very much for all coming, spending your afternoon with us. Well, my talk is going to be brief, and then I would like an opportunity to have questions and interactions, which I think will make this much more worthwhile. As a historian, my goal is to tell you or talk about a few things that relate to the Igbo past and how these events of the past can give us a window into understanding the Igbo today, but also how we can draw from the past to think about the future and to think about our humanity as Igbos. So my bias is in history. I have paid a lot of attention to Igbo history, particularly the interaction of the Igbo with European colonialism, as well as the impact of the Igbo people on the Atlantic diaspora. So I'm going to focus on two things. I don't know if we can move this. Okay, so I'm going to pay attention to a few themes, depending on what time we have. I'm going to begin by emphasizing the importance of history and how that relates to understanding people and people's identity. And then I'll pay some attention to how the Igbo people have been central to the making of what I call sub-Saharan Africa today. And then I will pay some attention to the Igbo people and how they have shaped what is today the Americas. When I talk about the Americas, I mean the mainland North America as well as the Caribbeans. How did the Igbo people shape the culture and identity of these parts of the world? And finally, if we have some time, I would like to talk a little bit about how the Igbo also shaped British colonialism and reshaped British policy throughout, not just in Nigeria, but throughout Africa after the 1929 Women's Revolt. And finally, following the Biafran experience, what do we learn from the intellectual, technological, and ideologies that came out of the Biafra Revolution? I would like us to think about the impact of the Ahara Declaration, a very small pamphlet that was published in towards the end of the war in 1967, and how that pamphlet as an ideology is critical to understanding the Igbo ideas and the manifesto, right, that shaped Biafra and Biafran identity, and how one may draw from that manifesto in terms of indigenous development ideas and ideologies. So, in the foreword to the book, Africa World History Project, The Preliminary Challenges, John Henrik Clarke wrote as follows, and I quote, "History is a clock that people use to tell their political time. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of the human geography. History tells a people where they had been, what they have been, and where they ought to be. It also tells the people where they are and what they are. Most importantly, history tells a people where they still must go and what they must be." John Henrik, in his book, African History Project, argued that history is a clock that people use to tell their political time of the day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people where they have been and what they have been. It is also it tells people where they are and where they ought to be. Most importantly, history tells a people where they still must go and what they must be. Like the history of many parts of the non-Western world, the history of the Igbo people has been an endeavor as marginalized as the continent's history. Yet, the Igbo past is truly a global tale in many respects. Understanding this past from a global perspective provides opportunity to rethink the past as it has been told through the traditionally Eurocentric narrative of the past. But most importantly, it helps us to reaffirm an Igbo identity, one that has been changing historically, but often contested too. My goal is to present, I think in a simple way, Igbo history and its major impact on different aspects of sub-Saharan Africa and global history. I would rely on direct and indirect evidence to accomplish this task. Perhaps the first place to begin is to think about the role and impact of the Igbo on the sub-Saharan African area or region of the world. By sub-Saharan Africa, I mean the whole part of Africa below the Sahara Desert. And I'll begin by a phenomenon that is known as the Bantu migration. I don't know if we can get the map, the slide. So perhaps the starting point is to think about early migration in Africa, something that began some 5,000 years ago. How did the Igbo people shape the history of East Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa? That's what I mean. Historians have used the term Bantu migration. And by Bantu migration, we use Bantu, the word Bantu, as a linguistic, to describe a linguistic group. And that means that Igbo language is related to several other African languages. So the Bantu family is a large language family that are related to each other. But within that context, there is what we may refer to as the Proto-Bantu language. And that includes Igbo. So if you look at the map that I have here, you can see the areas from which people began to expand and migrate to other parts of what is today sub-Saharan Africa. And that map shows you the area that is part of eastern Nigeria today, Cross River, and part of the Cameroon. This is the location of what is often referred to as the Proto-Bantu people. So perhaps the starting point is the migration and peopling of African continent. Current evidence points to the fact that human history began in Africa. Migration both in and out of Africa, weaves through this earliest human history. The peopling of the planet, the expansion of Bantu-speaking peoples, migration that began some 5,000 years ago, and perhaps, if you look at the map also, an extension of that migration to what I call the African diaspora in the New World. So, what is important, of course, is to understand how the Igbo people were critical to these two levels of migration. Internal within Africa, external within the African diaspora. And I mean by the word here, diaspora, if you look at what is today the United States, Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, there's a large proportion of black people in those parts of the world. What is important for us is to think about how those people ended up in what is today referred to as the New World or the Americas. Perhaps 70% of those who ended up in the African diaspora from what is known as the Bight of Biafra were Igbo speaking. Right? So, they constitute a very important part of what is today known as the African diaspora. Perhaps in a state like Virginia in the United States, 60% of black Virginians have Igbo ancestry. The same with Cuba, right? So, I'm looking at those two forms of migration and to think and understand why the Igbo is important in assessing those migrations and their outcome. So let me lay some emphasis on the Bantu migration, which occurred within Africa. And when I talk about the Bantu migration, I want you to look at it from a linguistic point of view. How and why is the Igbo language related to Kikuyu, spoken in East Africa? How is the Igbo language related to Xhosa, spoken in Southern Africa, right? How is it related to so many other languages in what is Sub-Saharan Africa? Linguistically, the Igbo speak a language that belongs to the larger family of languages known as Bantu or Niger-Congo. There's close to 100 million people across Sub-Saharan Africa speak these languages or related languages, collectively known as Bantu languages. How did this happen? What does the Igbo have in common with Kikuyu, as I mentioned earlier, Xhosa, etc.? They share a common linguistic affinity. Scholars have explained this through the phenomenon known as Bantu migration or Bantu expansion. By 1000 BC, in a series of migrations, Bantu speakers had spread south of the savannah, across Angola, and to the great lake regions of East Africa. Over the next 1,500 years, they scattered throughout the Central and Southern Africa, interacting with indigenous people and absorbing those indigenous people as they moved along. Their migration throughout Africa is one of the largest migrations in human history. A migration that began 1000 BC and continued to the 4th century AD. It can be speculated that the ancestors of the Igbo were part of these proto-Bantu speakers whose knowledge of agriculture, especially tuber production, yam production, and iron working technology helped to people and colonize the rest of the subcontinent. If I had mentioned, the Leja, right? Iron works, which I think is phenomenal. If you go to Leja in Nsukka, that people were already working iron smelting here, centuries back. Those skills were very central and the knowledge of yam production in the way the Igbo people began to expand and leave this area as they seek new opportunities for agriculture and absorbing indigenous people they encounter. Some of you may come across, if you look at Central Africa, the people they call the Pygmies, right? Have you heard the word Pygmies of the Congo, right? Those are indigenous people that these Bantu speakers, with their superior agricultural knowledge and iron technology, were able to absorb those people. But their language never remained sort of like Igbo. They incorporated other words from those existing languages. But what is important in terms of understanding the Proto-Bantu languages is that there are elements of those proto-languages that have been retained, right, in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, we use the word Omo, right, to refer to children of Omocheze, Omodes. Most Bantu speakers have the same prefix, Ba for people, right, Bakongo, and so on and so forth. So, a number of theories have been put forward to explain this migration. There is speculations that overpopulation encouraged some groups to move to new places in search of fertile land and in order to practice agriculture. It is important to emphasize that both the development of agriculture and the existence of unusually high population density have been a defining character of Igbo land even to today. The long history of plant domestication is evident in the large variety of food crops and edible plants in Igbo society. The variety of crops and plants attest to the antiquity of agriculture in Igbo region, including plants like, Africa rice, Guinea corn, Hungary rice, Bambara groundnut, etc., okra, and many, many others that were domesticated in this area and gave these migrants the skills and tools they use in expanding and conquering the rest of the continent. Now, accounts of captives of Igbo origin in the New World provide an unusual and rare glimpse into the agricultural and exchange economy of the Igbo. If you look at the walls over there, there's a picture of an Igbo ex-slave known as Olaudia Equiano. Has anybody heard about Olaudia Equiano? Right? No? Okay. So Olaudia Equiano was born in an Igbo village in 1745 and was sold into slavery when he was 11 years. Equiano recorded later when he wrote his autobiography in 1799, he recorded life and livelihood in his village. There are speculations that it comes from Iseke, which is today in Ihiala. And he talked about agriculture, 18th century, that agriculture is our chief employment, and everyone, even the children and women, are engaged in it. Thus, we have a habit of labor from our earliest years. Equiano's description of Igbo society and the economy in the 18th century is supported by accounts given by other Igbo slaves in the Americas. Another Igbo slave in Jamaica, known as Archibald Montet, was born in 1799 in Igbo land and was enslaved in Jamaica. He affirmed in his memoir that yams, potatoes, and Indian corn were an integral part of Igbo agriculture in the 17th and 18th century. 19th century accounts offer more perspective. In his journey to Bonny in 1840, Hermann Kohl, a German doctor, noticed that the Igbo exported agricultural produce and metal goods to Bonny. He described the Igbo as rich in natural products, including maize, rice, yam, oil or palm oil, dyewood, and cotton, and was quite indispensable in providing staple food to Bonny. Bonny is in the riverine area, right? W.E. Crew, who visited Nsukka in 1866, was impressed by the abundance of agricultural produce, and he described that in the market they abound in corn, palm oil, palm wine, fish, deer, meat, dog, and other products like fowl, tobacco, eggs, and yams. What I'm trying to emphasize is the importance of understanding the antiquity of agriculture in Igbo land. And it is this skill of agriculture and iron technology that enabled the Proto-Bantu speakers, which includes the Igbo, to expand and people what is today sub-Saharan Africa. Am I making sense? So, if you look at what is today sub-Saharan Africa from here to South Africa, this is the migration that began from this region and continued over thousands of years. That people didn't reach the Zulu, the Swana, the Soto, the Ndebele. They didn't reach what is today South Africa until about the 9th century. Not too long ago. That migration pattern began here some 5,000 years ago. So we can't understand the making of sub-Saharan Africa without really thinking and understanding the role of the Igbo and other Proto-Bantu speakers in what is today, right, West Africa, in the area of Nigeria and Cameroon. Let me go to the second point, which is, if you look at the Americas, which includes the United States and the Caribbeans, there's a long history which began when the Europeans emerged in West Africa in the 15th century, seeking gold, trying to buy gold, which was abundant in West Africa, and which formed an integral part of the trade between West Africa, North Africa, and the Mediterranean world up to the 15th century. By the 15th century, the Portuguese became interested in having a direct access to the gold of West Africa rather than buying from the Arab middlemen, right, who brought the gold from across the Sahara. This exploration of West Africa opened up opportunity for the first time for direct contact between Europeans and Africans. Imagine in West Africa to demand or to seek gold created the first opportunity for Europeans to begin also to trade and enslave, Africans. So the Atlantic slave trade began from the 15th, 16th century due to this contact between Africans and Europeans. Why is this of interest to us? If you look at the areas involved in the Atlantic slave trade, it is from the area of Senegal today to the coast of Angola, South and Southwest Africa. By the 17th century to the 18th century, most of those being enslaved into the New World was coming from what is today the Bight of Biafra, right? Bono, Calabar, right? And others. But most of the enslaved people were coming from the hinterland, from Igbo land, facilitated by the Aro, right? Using the Ibinukwabi. What is my interest here is perhaps to think about how the New World changed, because out of the number of enslaved people that came to the New World, there's estimate that perhaps 11% of those came from the Bight of Biafra and were Igbo. So in many important ways, This large number of Igbo people from the Bight of Biafra became very significant in terms of shaping New World culture. You can look at the map here to the table, to think about different areas where people from the Bight of Biafra, or mostly Igbo people, ended, and the percentage of those in the New World. So, as the evidence suggests, the large number of enslaved Africans from the Bight of Biafra were Igbo. David Eltis and Richardson estimate that about 1 in 7 Africans shipped to the New World during the era of the slave trade came from the Bight of Biafra, was Igbo speaking. This corresponds to about 11.9% of the total number, for which we have data today. Douglas Chambers suggests that about 11.6 million people were estimated to have been shipped to the New World between 1470 and 1860, and 1.7 million of those were transported from the Bight of Biafra. If his estimate is correct, it means that 80% of those shipped from Calabar, Bonnet to the New World were Igbo speaking. From a transatlantic perspective, and when compared with other, like the Yoruba, the Ewe, and many others, we do not have a lot of history of these Igbo people in the New World. In fact, we do not get a sense that the Igbo, to a very large extent, contributed greatly to the making of New World culture. What is important to emphasize, of course, is why is this the case? If you go to Bahia in Brazil, there's still people who practice traditional Yoruba religion. So when you look at the Atlantic world, you think, oh, it's a Yoruba that's sort of made up, right, the Atlantic world. Even though there were more Igbo people that were enslaved than many other groups. Why is this the case? My argument is that, for one thing, we have to understand why the Igbo and Igbo identity was largely suppressed in the New World. We come from an area, the Igbo come from an area where the nature of the political institution is very Republican. The Igbo didn't have a history of centralized power and authority, right? The idea that Igbo enweze. So that individualism shaped Igbo response to slavery. And I can tell you a few history of American planters advising slavers not to bring people from the Bight of Biafra because they didn't make good slaves. Right? Their response to slavery was quite different from many other groups from West Africa. Why? They thought the Igbo were a bad investment. They thought the Igbo were more susceptible to suicide. Many of them preferred to kill themselves rather than be slaves. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with the phenomenon, it's 200 years now, called Igbo landing in Georgia, where Igbo slaves were brought to the New World in Georgia, and they went in mass, right, in chains to the sea to drown rather than be slaves. So many planters didn't want people from the Bight of Biafra because it was bad investment. They didn't make good slaves. So you have descriptions in planters' diaries advising slavers in West Africa, do not buy people with fair skin. They are likely coming from the Bight of Biafra, right? They're likely Igbo. Compared with many other enslaved people, most Igbo people were fair-skinned. But if you go to Jamaica today, you're fair-skinned, they call you Red Igbo. Because most of them who came into those areas were of Igbo origin. So what is important, I think, to think about here is how this Igbo identity shaped slavery and the New World. One, I want to emphasize one thing, that if you look the accounts of rebellions throughout the Atlantic world, rebellions occurred where there was a large concentration of Igbo slaves. In Jamaica, in Haiti. Haiti was probably 60% Igbo. Haiti is the only part of the Western Atlantic world where enslaved people rose right, conquered slavers, and established a black republic. So, Jamaica, the same thing. This, of course, gives us a window into understanding what Fisher calls power waves. How did the Igbo respond to slavery, and how did their response shape the institution of slavery? But let me speak a little bit to some of the cultural impact that the Igbo brought to the New World that is still enduring today and shapes what we can talk about as American culture. We talked about the Igbo people as a young people at heart. If you have read Things Fall Apart, right? It makes this very evident. When we talked about the Bantu migration, we talked about why yam and the knowledge of yam and agriculture was central to the Igbo, transmitting, expanding throughout what is today West Africa and shaping sub-Saharan Africa. The Igbo transmitted aspects of their culture, including the yam culture. Here we have Ahajoko, right? But in places like Cuba, they have what they call Jonkonu, which is basically Ahajoko lecture. Ahajoko ceremony. Transmitting them into the New World that today they are part of New World culture and ideas and religion. There are certain crops that were brought into the New World, into the Caribbeans, that were of Igbo origin. I mentioned okra, right? Okra, the food culture that in many ways shapes the New World today, have some origin in Africa. Not just, the Igbo, but the ideas about cultivation of things like rice were introduced by the Angolan slaves and things like that. So the Igbo have been central and important in understanding and shaping the New World. Douglas Chamber identifies evidence of what he calls Igboisms in Anglophone American society, which includes Igbo dietary habits. Okra, for example, a staple of Igbo diet, was one pot soup, was identified as Igbo in origin. The vegetal parts of American food, culture, or what is called soul food today in southern United States, indicate a strong Igbo presence in Anglophone slave foodways. Most importantly, were yams, black-eyed beans, and greens. These were the basic food crops in 19th century and early 20th century Igbo society. In the diaspora, the Igbo continued to grow yams and maintain nearly all the secondary subsistence crops of their ancestral villages and agriculture. There's clear evidence of Igbo influence in power ways, or what Fisher has identified as attitude towards power and authority, and the patterns of political participation. Slaves in America drew on similar social resources in order to order their individual and collective lives. Though there were no major slave rebellions in areas such as the Chesapeake and Western Jamaica, where there was a strong Igbo presence, Igbo slaves tended to resort to more forms or other forms of resistance, including suicide, escape, concessional negotiations that in many ways shaped the slave culture and society. I talked a little bit about the John Canoe and other masquerade festivals that have their origin in West Africa that are still practiced in the New World today. The tradition of doctoring here we call dibia, right? Medicine and dibia. In the Caribbeans, they called obia, which is a corruption of dibia. These sort of ancestral or Igbo traditional medical practices have been transmitted into the New World and still form part of Afro-American and Afro-Caribbean culture today. I'm going to end so that we can have some time, by speaking very briefly on an important area that I think most of us may be familiar with, and maybe some of the young women here need to think about in terms of shaping their own identity. Many of us are familiar with the period of European colonialism in Africa. By 1903, when Lugard conquered the Northern Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, basically the North, most of what became the North, right, became incorporated as part of British colonial rule. But the British had sort of a different encounter with Igbo people. It took nearly 25 years from the Aro expedition, 1902, to the Ahara expedition, 1905, to many other expeditions, right, to the Ekumeku, resistance in Delta. It took more than 30 years for the British to subdue the Igbo people. Basically, annexing, pacifying one village after the other because of the nature of Igbo indigenous political system and structure. So, having established British rule, the British established what was known as indirect rule. In the North, it worked. The emirs became part of British rule. They already had authority. They were put in their place. In Yoruba land, the Obas became part of British administration. In Igbo land, where there wasn't a strong history of centralized authority, the British created what they called the warrant chief system. So they could come to your village and they say, my brother, you look like a strong man. They make you a warrant chief, And they are establishing new forms of authority that is not part of indigenous political systems and structures. So the Igbo, in many ways, resisted. And one of the most important forms of resistance came in 1929 with the 1929 Women's Revolt, right? Which occurred throughout eastern Nigeria. And women, in their thousands, rebelled against the British. What is important is not that they rebelled. What is important is what became the aftermath of that. That it is the Igbo resistance that shaped and reshaped British administration throughout Africa, not just in Nigeria. They gave up on the indirect rule system and in place of native administration. That's how they began to create native courts, right? And have local representations. How did the Igbo become central to reshaping British colonial policy? We got to think about that. How did this inform what became critical to understanding Igbo and other societies with the appointment of and commissioning of studies that today constitute what is known as intelligence reports? It was in the aftermath of the 1929 Women's Revolt. What I'm trying to emphasize is that the Igbo impact was not just local, right? It shaped British colonial policy throughout tropical Africa. I'm going to end by encouraging you to, if you haven't read it, the Igbo experience during the war gave us opportunity to think and gave us opportunity to show sort of the ingenuity of the Igbo people. I'm very sure some of you who are young will need to read about the Biafra War. But I want to point to a publication that came out during the war known as Ahara Declaration. I'm emphasizing that because today I read the Ahena Declaration as a manifesto, just as you will read every other manifesto, or the Arusha Declaration in Tanzania by Nyerere. What made the Ahena Declaration unique? It's not just about the political philosophy and ideas, but in it is sort of an indigenous development ideology that moves away from Western development ideas and ideals to one that encourages indigenous development relying on our knowledge and indigenous ideas. So, what is important, I assign this to my students in the United States. Read Ahena Declaration, read Arusha Declaration in Tanzania, and analyze how the indigenous ideas about development differ from Western development ideas, and to what extent this would have made a difference, right? If, for example, Biafra had succeeded as a country and as a state. Because by 1960s, Eastern region was the fastest growing developing economy in the whole of the developing world, including Asia. How did that happen? The Opera Revolution and things like that. How did that happen? Even though the war kind of ended that, development and ideas. What is important is what can we draw from these past ideas and Igbo contributions to the new world in terms of building a viable, right, society and culture in Igbo land? What lessons can we draw from these in understanding ourselves and our identity, and understanding what we have given to the world and the pride we can take in attempting to rebuild our own society looking on the past? So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to ask you to ask any questions if you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you so much. And just like that, the first part of the lecture has come to an end. I'm sure Prof had much more to share with us, and of course it's why we have the dialogue following the lecture. And now, Prof will be joined on stage by Mr. Chukwuma Ephraim Okenwa, Mr. CEO, who is... Okay, I see what happened here. So, Mr. CEO is a diplomat, an educator, and a social entrepreneur. And of course, if you observed, the applause was coming from students of Queen's Model Secondary School, which is his school.
Thank you so much, Professor Chima Korieh, for such an incisive conversation this evening. Igbo Gade, reclaiming the Igbo blueprint and the cultural and political evolution of sub-Saharan Africa, and by extension, the New World. And you will agree with me that Prof has done a very good job in taking us down the memory line, first by establishing the importance of history, because I understand in contemporary times, many argue that history should remain history. But Prof, referencing a scholar, I think by the name John Herridge, was able to establish the fact that history is both a compass and a clock. And taking us down the memory lane, he was able to help us to appreciate the roles that Igbo has played in reshaping what is currently known today as sub-Saharan Africa, and then also like both in the beyond the Atlantic, the Caribbean, or what he regularly referred to as the New World. And part of the thing I see as very, very important in the conversation tonight is that some of the things that Ndị-Ìgbò has been largely characterized by, Prof was able to establish that it's not something of 100 years ago. Like he spoke about migration, the fact that for 5,000 years, that our ability as Ndị-Ìgbò, to move from one place to another, and most importantly, we weren't just moving because we want to move. We also carried our prowess in agriculture and also iron work or iron technology, as our Prof has referred to that. And then also he was able to underscore that republican nature of the Igbo man to the extent of pointing out, that some Igbo slaves preferred to die than to actually remain slaves, and how that, our ability to revolt against what is oppression has helped to both shape policies, current day democracy, and even some cultures beyond. And then also one very important thing he mentioned before we start this interrogation is also mentioning that though the current day New World like we know is largely, most of the migrants are largely traceable to the Bight of Biafra, but when you go there, you could see that maybe some other dominant cultures, are prevalent, and Prof also tried to explain why he thinks that is the case. The very fact that as Igbos, we're individualistic and all of that. So Prof, to deepen this conversation, I'm going to ask some few questions. Like when you were speaking, my heart was actually boiling, and I'm sure most of the participants also want to, So you spoke about history. So let's take it from there. But before I get to history, let me start on a very light mood, right? So I discovered, Prof, you were speaking and your accent was very much that of an Igbo. And then when I saw the flyer and saw Marzi, the Arabs are usually very intentional. When an Arab, despite being a professor, could go like Al-Haji, he wants you to know where he's coming from. So why has your accent remained the same? And why do you also want to let everybody know that you are Marzi? Just on a lighter mood because we are driving to somewhere.
Well, maybe my brain is not wired. It's not wired to change my accent. Sometimes I have this conversation sometimes with my kid, and then he said, "Dad, that's not how to say it." If I say, "Okay, you can't teach me how to speak English now. I already learned how to speak Mbise, Nigerian English." So, yeah. So. I think sometimes we tend to try to copy. If you listen to somebody who's British, you basically know that this guy is British. If you listen to somebody who's Irish, you know he's Irish or Scottish. It's many Africans who pretend that we are something that we are not, right? And even in the United States, there's some people who will speak from certain parts of the United States, you won't understand what they're saying. If somebody from the South is speaking, it's different from Boston or New York accent. So which one am I supposed to adopt? New York or...
Okay, so thank you so much. That's on the lighter mood. So you spoke about the importance of history, and before now, those who were old enough to experience the Biafran War, Nigeria Civil War, especially those from Saudis, has been embarrassed that the whole thing has been lopsided, starting from the narratives that is put out there. Secondly, to the fact that today, when we celebrate the Army Day, right, which we know where it stemmed from, celebrating on the Nigeria side, the armies that lost their lives, there's no inclusion. In fact, the word Biafra became almost like a crime to mention, right? And in so much that when the recent curriculum was introduced for history, there was no single mention about the Biafran War, which is one of the most defining events in Nigeria. So for such kind of things, what do you think should be the response of Igbos, like critical stakeholders, and such that an aspect of history, 30 months defining moment of the nation, was deliberately, after the agitation that we can't deal, with excluding a past that is very significant like this. And like we could see, several years after, the agitation has continued in Southeast. So how would you assess such kind of, omission by those preparing the curriculum for our students?
Yeah. They say every history is political, because it's written from the perspective of those who write the history. So if somebody is writing the history of the Biafra War from the federal perspective, they're going to write a different history. It doesn't mean that objectivity in history doesn't count. That's very important. But the politics of history is sometimes historians have to think about what their writing contributes to, or how it contributes to shaping, right, social consciousness in society. So if you're writing the history that excludes aspects of the Nigerian history and narrative, then that history is not complete. If you're writing a history that silences certain voices for political purposes, then we are not open to the reality, right, that societies need to address the past in order to move forward. Look at what happened in some places like Rwanda after the genocide. Rwanda understood the impact that has on society. And the idea of social justice and addressing the past has been critical to Rwanda moving forward. The same thing happened in South Africa with the reconciliation. Right? But the case with Nigeria is that it's been so politicized that even within Igbo land, people are afraid to talk about including the Biafran experience in history. Right? I'll give you one example. I was in Nsukka in history 2016. In history at Nsukka, the student wanted to organize sort of a debate around Biafra. The whole university was, there was call from everywhere. You can't do that. You can't do that. This is Nsukka. Nsukka is the intellectual, right, root of Biafra. Most of those who wrote the Ahira Declaration were people who were teaching at Nsukka. If you can't debate or talk about Biafra in Nsukka, how can Ahmadu Bello talk about it? Ahmadu Bello University, right? So we are afraid to confront history and to address the past because of, political expediency. Yeah.
Okay, so, like Prof, when you were speaking, I began to really think deeply that when something is a trait, right, as in something that this is us, then we're unapologetical about that, because when you spoke about our Republican nature, how it has both helped in our unique advancement, posing resistance, and how that has also created some forms of enmity, we have to keep these people under. We'll have to find like a template to ensure that, we're going to destabilize them as a people. But regrettably, it does appear that in Igbo land today, right, even though like we are free amongst ourselves in the 5 eastern states, you've also have like a situation where we've not been able to leverage that our Republican nature to build a template of governance different from regions where historically, like you pointed out, has had hero worship as an order. Don't you think we should be different in any way, since that we are Republican, we've been democratic, but all of that has not culminated into a better experience in governance? How do you think we can leverage our uniqueness as a people to create a new governance model that we truly distinguish this region as it was, early when our region was, one of the fastest growing in terms of economy?
I think one of the most important changes that are shaping place is balkanization of Igbo land in addition to other parts of Nigeria, right? The creation of states beginning with Gowon was a very significant moment in the history of this country because it was one way in which the idea or sense of Igbo ethnic identity became destroyed and less important. And the creation of more states within Nigeria, including Igbo land, has continued to sort of create boundaries of difference that, today we're talking about Anambra, Enugu, Imo. Sometimes in terms of what divides us rather than what holds us together as Igbo people. And that is a shame because most of our political leaders, unlike in the past, are playing into the national politics, right? They are more interested in being relevant at the national level, no matter what is at stake, rather than thinking about the Igbo as a geographical area and how they can leverage upon, right, the resources within here to create a development zone that will benefit the whole region as a whole. So that's sort of a challenge, basically. So political marginalization is part of the outcome of balkanizing, ethnic groups in Nigeria for, beginning with Gowon.
Do you think the Igbo nation in any way is challenged with identity crisis? Considering the fact that many parents are sincere that, if my children can speak English, then that's an indication of being educated. You stay in the United States of America, and I understand in the US, some from other cultural divides could make provision for their children to learn Yoruba, learn Hausa, and they take delight in it, even when you see professors. But the template for measuring who is educated here, it's your ability to speak in certain accents and all the rest of it. Are you concerned at the fact that Igbos tend to dissociate themselves with everything that has to do with our identity, both in terms of culture, both in terms of language? You go to conferences, I'm sure sometimes you see a lot of, maybe you go with other Nigerian professors and others, like an Hausa man wouldn't have a problem dressing as Hausa. But most Igbos maybe will come on suits. And then a few others, that may come with their typical regalia is being looked as perhaps not being sensitive. Do you consider the Igbo nation as, being challenged with identity crisis, and how do we really begin to address this? Because when you were speaking so much about the Igbo identity, we cannot help it but to be proud of who we are. But how do we get this message all along to begin to retool the Igbo nation on that part where an average Igbo person can be proudly Igbo irrespective of where you are?
I mean, this is very complex, and I think over time, identity has always been fluid, right? In terms of how you think about yourself and what it means to be Igbo, what it means to be Nigerian. So we all carry multiple identities. But one of the most damaging aspects of colonialism is the impact it has had on, African Igbo identity. Perhaps language is one critical element of that. Because I think language is the most important form of identity. You look at Africa today, it's French, Portuguese, English. Those are sort of the official languages, right? So people understand that to move ahead in life, you need to embrace this sort of universalist ideas and ideals, that English language and all those kind of things as the language of the global economy and that is very critical to your survival in life. There are people who have balanced that with also retaining aspects of their culture and way of life. So if you go to Japan, you can study in Japan with the Japanese language. They brought aspects of their indigenous religion, indigenous life into, right? Their development ideas and ideology. So they copied from the West what is good, but they combined those with aspects of their indigenous life and culture. And it's worked out for them. The Igbo society, most Igbo people are doing damage to the next generation, the younger generation. And many of those, including those in the US, young people are coming up now, medical doctors, lawyers, to understand that the parents did a lot of damage to them by preventing them from understanding the Igbo language. Now, some of them are coming back here to do language courses, right? And then blaming their parents because you think you're doing the best for your kids, but the Chinese are learning Mandarin. They are at Harvard, they are at Yale, they are in the Ivy League universities. But they're speaking Mandarin at home, right? The Indians are doing the same. There's some efforts, in the United States, like places like Chicago, for example, the Center for Igbo Studies, to teach kids the language. You have a lot of Igbo students, second-generation students who are in universities. When they need a foreign language that includes Igbo, then they're looking for, right? How do we balance this desire to use Igbo language, and then maybe it saves you from paying for a course or learning French, and then the challenge of not really understanding that language. I have conducted exams for universities for students. Some of them can listen, speak a little bit of Igbo, they can't read. You have to evaluate them on the ability to read, write, and speak the language. That's a challenge. At University of Toronto, I could get away with just studying French, right? Because I have Igbo language, and I could speak and write Igbo. I said, okay, my study is going to be in Igbo area. So it has an advantage. Some parents are doing, okay, my daughter speaks Igbo. She's 24. She speaks Igbo very well because I made a conscious effort to speak Igbo in the house. That's a challenge, I think, but it's even worse, like in Enugu here. I know there are many parents who...
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so two more short questions and then we'll open up the mic. The next will be, so when you spoke about agriculture, and also like connected it to our yam culture, which we have also like impacted some parts of Africa. And I was really thinking, Igbos then and now, and you did mention that we exported foods. And in contemporary Nigeria, we've had time where people from some parts of the country threatened not to allow the movement of food to the southeast. And in my heart, I said, what happened? So, Prof, what happened and how can we begin to reclaim that identity, to really reflect our position in terms of agriculture as something of, as a matter of identity, not just as a practice.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, most of the early accounts, it points to the Igbo people as an agricultural people at heart. Equiano, many others, and many Europeans, even Ezar, they talked about how the Ezar use manure and the centrality of agriculture to their lives. There's been a lot of changes, basically. One of the most important things, I think, is to think about what I call agricultural evolution. there's been movement away from agriculture to other, activities, particularly with Western education and things like that. So you have an aging population that doesn't have the kind of labor that you need for agriculture and agricultural purposes. Some of them are environmental. There are places in eastern Nigeria where people were dependent on agriculture in the past, but today you can't have an acre of land. In places like Mbise, if you want to be an agriculturalist, plant, there are people who do not have an acre of land, So the population density is so intense in parts of Igbo land beginning from the 1940s. You can see some areas more than 1,000 per square, So agricultural evolution, movement into other areas has been fundamental, and then the lack of labor and the idea that, agriculture is less prestigious and things like that, that it's sort of made it very dependent, us very dependent on the market for survival. Even for core things, very simple things like planting, vegetables and planting pepper. When I was growing up, everywhere in the village, every woman planted, had pepper. You can see everywhere. But now, I walk through my village, you can't see a pepper farm. Then you go to the market, you buy very small stuff for like 500. I'm like, what is going on, right? So that's a challenge. And we've lost the core value that is attached to agriculture as a form of identity, right? And you're a man because of your yam barn. You're a man because you're defined by the quantity of yam you produce. You're a woman because your cassava or your cocoyam defines what you are. That sort of affirmation of identity that's dependent on agriculture has kind of disappeared. Right?
Okay, so one more question for you, and then we open the mic for questions from the participants. The word reclamation somehow suggests like it's almost we are losing it. And from your lectures, we can understand we've not only had a blueprint that others replicate across the globe, and it's making waves through that, we've also left our footprints all across. But when you look at the center, of this blueprint and the footprint, there's a need for reclamation. So question will be, who will do this reclamation? When and how do you think this would happen? How do we move from here? Just moving beyond the theory now to like taking practical steps. If you are to mention 3 steps you think all of the participants here and those joined virtually can take, what do you think is 1, 2, 3 steps we need to do to begin to ensure that when you come to the headquarters of this nation that have so impacted the new world and sub-Saharan Africa, you're really going to confirm that this is indeed the headquarters?
It's very challenging in the contemporary context because if you look at the world today, you look at Nigeria as a whole, the East particularly has a challenge that has its origin in the war. The post-war challenges have never abated in many ways. So it leaves this region with less opportunities. It leaves this region with a crisis in terms of infrastructure, in terms of job opportunities. Young people are left with no option than to seek opportunities abroad. Some people may look at it in terms of, this is an Igbo advantage. There are many people abroad who would like to reinvest here. There are many people abroad who would like to return like they did in the 80s. But the atmosphere and the conditions is not allowing that. Look at all over the world, the people who are excelling You can't walk into a hospital in the United States and look at the name of the doctors. You'll find 2, 3 Igbo and Yoruba, perhaps, Yoruba doctors. It's the same with, if all the Nigerians live in the medical area, the American health system will collapse. But we have a crisis here, right? We have a crisis where we are not leveraging on these opportunities that can help rebuild. The Indians did it. The Japanese did it. They went to America, studied, went back and rebuilt their society. The enabling environment is not here. So we got to fix the fundamental problems and issues here, including security issues. But there is challenge with leadership here. Because if Peter Mba is doing something here, and in Imo State somebody is doing something else, there's no coordinated attempt to sort of address some of the challenges that we face as Igbo, and that would create the environment for people to start thinking about coming home or investing at home.
Thank you so much, Prof. And on that note, can we once more celebrate him while we now open up the mic for you to contribute? So please, the mic, yes. Let's start, okay? So please, yes. We'll take 2 from this side and then 2 from this side, and then we'll still come back. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, Prof, and thank you for answering some of the questions that agitate my mind. My question is very brief, but before then, I want to start with in 2021, I remember, or 2022, the Buhari administration scrapped the study of history in our schools. And then, having traveled to Sokoto and seen a hall called Ariwa Hall, and also in Ibadan, seen another one called the Oduduwa Hall. And here in Igbo Enclave, I've not seen anything like Biafra Hall or Biafra Museum or Biafra anything attached to that. So by that, I want it goes along with the saying that nobody dates you without your consent. So I want to ask you this evening, are you by this lecture calling on the Southeast governors? Sorry using the word Southeast, I prefer using Eastern governors. Are you by this lecture calling on them to reinstate the study of history in our primary schools, secondary schools, and most especially state-owned universities, to making sure that we bring up this topic to the front burner? Thank you very much.
Okay, Prof.
Yeah, I think history has been studied in the schools right now, so, which is great. I support a primary school in Owerri, and I looked at the curriculum for, the primary school history. Most of it is all history, but at least, something is being done. So, part of that process is really the politics of memory, because history is where, right, you teach the past, you also teach people critical thinking, you teach them analytical thinking skills, so that people do not behave as robots. They can question, authority, they can question power. You can transfer those skills you learn in history to interrogating. You can channel them to social movements. You can understand why society is the way it is. So if you suppress history, then you put people in the dark. And I think that's part of this whole process. And in the attempt to stop the teaching and understanding of the Nigerian past, especially the history of the war, we have a problem of really denying the younger generation an opportunity to understand their past in order to elevate, their future. So history is already in the curriculum. What is important is what is the content of the curriculum. right? What is included in the curriculum? There's a guy from Princeton who is currently doing a study in Nigeria right now from Princeton. He's a white guy from the United States studying the inclusion. To what extent is the Nigerian Civil War experience included in the curriculum? This is an American from Princeton University, right? And we're not doing that at home here. It's an American coming here to study, and they're running a pilot now in Lagos and Abuja in high schools, right? With teachers and students to see whether his instruments and ideas and survey make sense. He's going to get a PhD studying exclusion of history or the Biafran War from Nigerian history curriculum. Why are we afraid, right, back home, even in our own schools, to include local content in the curriculum? Nothing stops you from including aspects of your indigenous history, experience, and ideas, right? Even if it's done as extracurricular activities. But we are afraid to talk about our own experience. And if we don't do it, nobody is going to do it.
That's right. Thank you. Please, the next person from this side, and then we'll take two from this side. And
Okay, Prof. Good evening, sir. I am Chris Anibogo. Thank you for lending us into part of your knowledge, because we've come to borrow. Every man must borrow to become richer. So thank you very much, sir. Of all you've said, I really do wish I could touch one or 2 points. But then, Prof, my personal worry is when I look at that concept of Igbo, Enweze, I become worried in the current day Nigerian structuring. I don't know if, according to you, how you see that concept of Igbo Enweze. Because if we go back to the pre-Igbo colonial, pre-colonial society, yes, that concept made us egalitarian, it made our system acephalous. It works. But currently, sir, that concept of Enweze is going to the current young people coming from the southeastern part of Nigeria to actually take their rightful place in the running of affairs in the current Nigeria. Please, sir. Thank you.
I think the concept of Igbo, in a philosophical sense, doesn't mean that the absence of institutions of power and authority. It means that political power and authority is decentralized, but it doesn't mean the absence of any sort of power structure and authority. So even within a kinship system or a clan system, there is still an understanding that a particular individual, whether by age or particular, characteristics, is the head of that. What it means is because of the different or numerous layers of power and authority and structure, the Igbo do not have sort of they do not have sort of a political system and structure in which one individual takes so much power and arrogates so much power to the rest of the society. And I think that's kind of important in the way I looked at, I talked about the Igbo response to slavery, right? I'm not saying that the other societies were so docile, but if you look at areas where there were Islamic systems or where you had centralized powers, like in the Yoruba society and culture, their response to political structures and authority was quite different from the Igbo. It didn't mean the Igbo didn't recognize. After all, there are many sayings in Igbo society that make reference to king, right? Ihawu Ezeji, right? So what is the term? What does the term Eze mean? We may not translate it directly into king, but it means like, somebody has a higher power and authority than the rest, right? So, Ihawu Eze Umanumano, right? We have folk laws. They say, that means there's a recognition. If it's Mbe has something that others do not have that makes him king, right? It may be not his age. For us, it may be age and stuff like that. It may be, position as a priest, an oracular priest. But there is still a recognition that institutions of law and authority are obeyed, but the only thing that the legal system and the process through which that is done is not through a particular individual. In contemporary society, there's sort of the creation and bastardization, right, of chieftaincy institutions. My own in my village is like 20 years now, but you go to my village, they write ancient kingdom, right? And the Eze, there's some now answering Royal Majesty in my, near my village. Royal Majesty, right? And then they're creating all this sort of aura of political power and authority that has no basis. So what I see really is sort of a crisis of identity when it comes to our political systems and structure. We have a crisis of identity. I don't know, in my area we have this stuff we have a local meeting that is called Aladema. This is the power at the very local level. It's men, in some places it's women, and they meet maybe once a week. They look at cases, people bring their issues, and they can judge some cases outside of the influence of the law and the state and the local government. But there are also areas where they cannot intervene. If you kill somebody, Aladema is not going to do it, right? We have this crisis that at some level we have returned aspects of our indigenous political system and structure at a very local level. At a higher level, that is being challenged by new state institutions and structure. So when the governor makes somebody a chief, it's very political, right? Or a king. Or when you go to parts of Enugu here, you have the phenomenon that this person is Diala, right? This person is, what's the other one? Huh? No. I know I went to part of Okonano, right? Yeah, so they say this village is Diala.
Okay, yes,
and then
yes,
they say
yes.
this village
That's
is
Ohu and Amadu, yes.
Amadi, sorry, Amadi and
system,
Ohu,
yes.
right? And then you can't hold some political power because you are, and then you can't dance Igede because, and I'm trying to understand really why those in political authority and power still, despite the economic dynamics, you can't say, this person is richer than this, right? Because these villages have some level of economic equity. But at the social and cultural level, you're trying to retain aspects, right, of that indigenous, I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to understand why is this the case, right? Is it because now the so-called Ohu, some of them are economically very viable. And now, if you don't have any other way to bring them down or challenge them, their participation, you say, okay, they can't do us together.
Yeah.
Or they can't marry. I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, but this is very interesting in terms of how politics and institutions of power and authority, like kinship system, right? That is introduced, that is foreign to Igbo land, is shaping contemporary Igbo society. So what happens is that the other group there says, okay, we'll have our own Igwe. Right? It happens in my village. You quarrel with this village. My village is very small. We have a king. You quarrel with the other village. They say, okay, we want our own king. And you go to the meetings, kids will say, who is Onyeze? That's the thing, Iwenweze, right? Because it doesn't have the kind of indigenous root that you find in many other societies. But it doesn't mean the absence of, political structures or systems, or that the Igbo live in anarchy. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a long, rambling question. I don't know whether it answers the question.
Thank you so much. And then from this end, yes.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Uche Gabriel is my name. Let me start by thanking you for the lecture. And I want to draw your attention to the need to evaluate the impact of what they do to us versus what we do to ourselves. And then I want to ask, is this really an eternally hopeless situation? Now, is the reclamation process entirely vested on what government could do or not do? And I'm also curious to understand, doesn't the Republican nature of the Igbo man suggest that this reclamation could begin with us rather than waiting for the government endlessly?
Okay, so let's have more questions, and after that, Prof will, yes. I'm taking note. After that, Prof will just respond to all. Okay.
Okay, Prof, thanks very much. I came in shortly after the lecture started, and the first impression I had was that maybe the number of Igbo slaves were quite relatively large. I don't know whether that's, compared to other people from other ethnic groups. So, Najo, is it possible that we sold far more slaves for some particular reason? And what would be that reason? Is it related to the Igbo greed, the quest for money, or is there any other reason why we may have sold more slaves than others? Secondly, we agree. Okay, I have a concept that contemporary Igbo society is being shaped by the outcome of the Civil War to a large extent. And my thinking that the influence of those that conquered Biafra in the organization of society has largely impacted what we now practice. And because we now see people who ordinarily will not even be able to sit in a congregation in a meeting of Umunna, now becoming the kings. We see governors, we see councillors, we see local government chairmen who were ordinarily riffraffs. Now, I don't know to what extent you think that this, my theory, may make sense. And what you think may be the way to reclaim governance and put it back into the hands of right-thinking men. Because indigenously, the people that govern Igbo land, Igbo Nweze, you earn the right to govern. But now it appears as though we are now appointing people who never earned it. And that's influencing also even the things we see in the society. So I don't know what you may have to say to that, sir.
Thank you. So two more here and two more here, and we are done.
Now I'm going to forget the question.
Okay. No, I'm noting down.
Okay.
I'm noting down, yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Okay, so my question is this. I'd like you to explore the possible underlying factors that contribute to this rapid decline in Igbo language transmission among young parents. As we observe, most young parents don't communicate in Igbo language with their children. What strategies can be employed from your perspective as a historian to mitigate this trend and promote the propagation of Igbo language again to the younger generation? Because I find it very disheartening and worrisome about the next generation after this young generation. Because if this young generation barely understands our Igbo language, what is the fate of the generation after that and the fate of our language? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I think, yes.
All right, thank you, Prof. I will need your recommendation for the Igbo youth at this time where we have a sizable chunk of Igbo youth that love Nigeria, the concept of one nation. And at the other divide, we have also a chunk of Igbo youth that we cannot neglect that wants to be on their own. Of course, we know the resurgence of this agitation. So we have one divide that wants one Nigeria, and the other divide that wants to be in their own nation. What will be your recommendation, especially at this time? Thank you, sir.
Okay. So two more questions on that side. Prof will attend. If I still have more time, and then we can ask more. Okay. Please go ahead.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Chukwudi Utazi. And I just wanted to maybe add some more flesh to Mr. Uche Gabriel's question. I hope the questions are in the same vein. So I wanted to ask, just like you spoke, Prof, about the statistics of Igbo slaves that were moved from here to the New World. It means we have another country, if you like, existing in those geographies. And I just wanted to ask, how do we harness that demography for our own socio-political and socio-cultural good? I'm asking this because earlier this week I attended the Johannes and Igbo retreat 2025, and at that event, the Obi of Onitsha spoke about the untapped resources, both human, financial, and other resources that are concentrated in the diaspora. So, do we consider these other brotherhoods of ours as Igbos in diaspora? Is it possible for us to also harness, whatever resources we can from there for our own socio-political and socio-cultural good? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening.
Just want to appreciate you for that wonderful lecture. Then, my question is, what is the Igbo race doing in terms of consolidating their history? When we learn from Rwanda, if you go to the Rwandan Center for Remembrance and Learning, you will discover a lot of things, a lot of mistakes that were made, and their moves towards correcting those mistakes. Something happened recently which I think that some of us did not pay attention to. The students wrote JAMB, and only the southeast states were affected. This happened in 2023, and we did not pay attention to it. And when we go to Rwanda and we want to learn how all these things happened, it started with what I call academic genocide. Because when these things happened, when the JAMB saga happened, we started tracing it, and we discovered that the same thing happened in 2023. I called my friend who is a data analyst and all these web designers and the rest. He told me that there is no way an exam that has the same format will have different channels of disseminating. That is to say that if a data here is affected, that means the entire exams should be affected. I was expecting the Igbo race to raise a voice, and I discovered that it was only non-academic staff unions of University of Nigeria were raising voices. And if we don't pay attention to these things, if you don't learn from the situations if you don't learn from Rwanda, to know that the Hutus were kind of being suppressed by the Tutsis, their academic learning, their prowess, we are bound to repeat that same mistake. Because if you look at the Nigerian situation, and if you look at the history of JAMB over the years, Igbos have been the one topping the charts, both in academics. If you look at the academic level of the Southeast, you will discover that Igbos have been the one topping the charts. And JAMB released a statement which we don't know the purport of that statement. When they said that they improved on their system to check exam malpractices, it was an indirect way of saying something, that these people are condoning exam malpractice. An indirect way of trying to downplay our academic prowess. So, and this concept of Igbo Gadi that we are trying to kind of advocate for, that we are trying to fight for, we cannot actually achieve this if the Igbos don't come up with a voice, if we don't try to speak up in things of this nature. When I told someone,
okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, and finally, I see Riches, and then we need one lady. Is there any lady that wants to ask a question? Okay, I think yes, and finally, so Riches and her, and then we'll get back to Prof. If there is still time, we'll still give more room. So please, Riches,
okay.
Make it short and simple. Thank you.
Prof. It's a privilege to be here. Mr. CEO. My question, so if we want to start learning mathematics and physics in Igbo language in the year 2026 latest, what is the fastest way to get that done, considering the current governance structure? Like, what is the solution? How can we start putting that into action? That physics, maths, and every other of these subjects we learn, secondary level, university level, we are learning them in Igbo language, textbooks in Igbo language. How do we get that done by 2026? Thank you, sir.
And finally, please, give to, yes. I think Prof loves that question. Prof.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, good evening.
Yeah, so my father recently, he started documenting our language. I'll say my indigenous language. I'm from Okana in Udi. So when we speak, he tries to trace each word to the roots. And recently, I was speaking with Iha in the ED of the center, and I raised the question why Things Fall Apart is not written in Igbo language, despite having written in translated to hundreds of other languages. And he made the case that Chinachebe wanted it written in Ogidi language. And we also find this argument about what is Central Igbo, what constitutes Central Igbo. You find people from Anambra saying that it's Anambra language that is central, or from Imo. And then you have certain parts of Imo states agitating that it is this part of Imo states that makes up, what is to be Central Igbo. With all these balkanizations that we have within the Igbo nation, as the case may be, how do we even begin to document our history how do we even begin to reclaim these blueprints when we cannot harness and integrate or even come up with something as simple as what is our language as Igbos?
Thank you so much. So I will let Prof start with that question and then we'll read out the rest. So you see all of the controversies. Yeah. Ours is the authentic Igbo. Yeah. Theirs is not the authentic Igbo. How do we even begin to document, our history? How do we find like a common ground, to begin to, move forward as a people?
Yeah, I think this is sort of a complex issue. Some of the early orthography were actually written not by Igbo people, right? And the complexity of language is the area for people in linguistics. But I'm going to give you my own view and perspectives. Over time, there's been some attempt to create what is known as Iwezwe, or sort of a common orthography that everyone will be able to understand. Because there's certain parts, if somebody from Nsukka is speaking Afikpo, I will not understand, or Hafia. But there's an acceptable orthography that most people would understand. I think Obalo and others have done a lot of work. It's something I think the Igbo states or Igbo intellectuals or Igbo groups and associations, should come together and work to develop a common system of language that draws from the different cultural groups and that is understandable and intelligible to every Igbo person. That attempt has been haphazard, but I think more attention and consistent attention needs to be made in that regards. So the Department of Igbo in all the eastern states, probably look at this as sort of a project that can be done and supported by the state or other institutions and foundations to create this sort of a common acceptable language. Right? I don't know if this makes sense anyway.
Thank you. Prof, we have 10 questions to go. How many minutes do we have? Let me know how many minutes? Do we have 10 minutes? Maybe one minute for each question. How many minutes to go? We're out of time? We're past. Can we get 10 minutes for Prof to respond? One minute to each of the questions? Is it possible? So, yeah. Prof, please. I'm sure many people want to just, even if it's hello to their question, right? Okay, so I take it maybe in the descending order. So if one wants STEM courses, right? Physics, mathematics, to be learned in Igbo language by 2026, what's the fastest route?
Well, I think technology is very important in the way people are recreating and creating knowledge, right? Artificial intelligence, I think these are areas that we need to explore. How can you use AI? How can you use technology? How can you write, programs in Igbo, right? How can you have Igbo in Google, so that it becomes a language that, young people can understand, because that's the medium through which they are accessing the world and information. So, and learning these sort of things in indigenous language, I think, is also very important. But 2026 is very ambitious.
Okay, so a young man there expressed his worry, citing Jamband, Rwanda experiences, wondering if the Igbo nation is actually leveraging history to protect the future. Citing instances there could be like a possible annihilation gradually, So how do you think we can leverage our knowledge of history to begin to protect the future as a region?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, essentially, I began this lecture by emphasizing that history is what actually gives you direction. You understand the past, you understand the present, and you want to project on the future, right? So without history, you can't even think and understand where society is going. You can't make policies and programs that are in line with, right, addressing the past, whether it is inequalities, past inequalities, or whatever. And you can't even negotiate in terms of inter-ethnic relationships if you have no knowledge of history and how history shapes public policy at the local as well as the federal levels.
Okay, thank you. And Chukwudi, I think, is that Chukwudi or Taz? Yes. So he wondered if Igbo can actually take advantage of, the massive demography, we have in the Caribbean, right? And other nations to the, can it be of any socio-economic benefit to Igbo? How can we leverage on that to ensure faster development for the Igbo nation?
I think there's basically two diasporas. One is a diaspora that emerged in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. And that diaspora, of course, has its own tensions between that African diaspora and people in the continent. Because to a large extent, the tension is there. The idea that, they were sold into slavery, and part of that, blame lies on people in the continent. So we need to bridge the gap and divide between that diaspora and those new diaspora as well as the continent itself. I think that kind of bridging and understanding our connections is the most important way to go. But we can rely on the new African diaspora, mostly new migrants beginning from the 1960s and for developmental purposes.
Okay,
right?
okay. Okay, and then Mr. Sampson requested to know what would be your recommendation. Some Igbo young persons want to remain in one Nigeria, others are agitating for Biafra. What would be your recommendation? Biafra or one Nigeria?
I do not have a recommendation for that,
okay.
basically. But I think, what is fueling the new, Biafra movements is some basic acceptance that the conditions that led to the war and the post-war conditions have not been addressed. And most of those leading these are people who were not even born during the war, right? And they understand that even though their parents want to be silent about the past, they want the past to go, they are understanding the war from social media, they're understanding what happened to the Igbo people. And this is one way in which they relate that to contemporary, inequality, political and social inequality, economic inequality. And it's really fueling the sort of social movements that we have now. I think one way to do that is for Nigeria as a whole, like what happened in Rwanda and other places, to address the past and then find ways of reconciling, right? And then maybe a form of transitional justice where people reckon with the past and then forge ahead for the future.
Okay, so the first lady that spoke, she wondered why there is that decline in esteeming Igbo language in terms of training children and what could be the strategy to ensure that people can take pride in that language, even in raising their kids.
Yeah, I mean, this has to start at every level. Like I said, I run a school in Owerri. I insisted that they teach Igbo language in the school. So my kids learn English, they learn French, but they also learn Igbo language. So if you make that a priority at home and in the schools, then they understand the value of it. And they take pride in that language. And that's the only way we can rescue the language. We can speak all the grammar about, if we don't start at schools and in the houses and homes, then we have a problem.
Okay, and then Uche Gabriel has this to say. This is his question. He wondered if the reclamation process, right, can just be like a function of the government. Is it what we rely on government, like in terms of this reclamation we are speaking about? and then also asked if Igbos has been largely Republican in nature, would it be right to assume that the people on themselves could actually take their destiny into their hands by helping this reclamation to happen?
That's kind of complex, right? Because I think most of where we are today in Igbo society is largely influenced by forces beyond our own immediate environment. Whether it's politics, what is happening at the national level is largely influencing and in many ways, shaping our response to domestic issues, right? So one way we may think about that is how do we leverage this sort of traditional human living among the Igbo, right? That has been the basis of Igbo oneness, the Igbo nation, the Igbo union. That kind of concept of Republican human living that is embedded in Igbo society is something we have to leverage. But part of the process has to start from, this sort of environment, and then at the political level, with the right leadership, that can happen.
And finally, Prof, there's a two-in-one question posed by, I consider him a philosopher, right? Who wondered if there is any link or nexus, right? Between the fact that Igbos, sold massive number of slaves. Do you think in any way that impacted on the current population, right? Accounting for lesser states in the southeast. And then he also says, he attributed the current crop of leadership, right, that we have in Igbo, which he considered as not deserving, and that in one way or the other, the civil war may have influenced this crop of leadership, and he requested to know how we can actually begin to retool to have the right kind of leaders in Igbo land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea, I think the issue of enslaved Igbo people is a phenomenon that has been studied by many scholars now, that is largely a large number of people here. But the emphasis, the important thing is to think about the slave trade as something that didn't happen in a haphazard way. Ships didn't just leave Europe and then come to every part of, it wasn't haphazard. Portuguese ships ended up in particular parts of West Africa, and disembarked in particular parts of the New World. British ships came from particular areas, came to the Gold Coast, Biafra, and ended up basically like in mainland North America and British colonies in the Caribbean. So it wasn't a haphazard, affair. We can understand and estimate, for example, how many ships embarked here, how many slaves ended up in the New World, and where those slaves disembarked. That makes for the sort of large-scale concentration of people of different ethnic groups in particular parts of the New World. And the process through which large numbers of people were enslaved here was quite different from centralized societies, where, in fact, states emerged, like in Senegambia and Ghana, where states emerged to create the conditions for enslavement, making wars. But here, it was a different process. There was no wars, basically no wars, but kidnapping and, the Aro developed a unique system that garnered enslaved people throughout Igbo land through those networks. And it was a very efficient system that channeled so many people, right, into the Atlantic. I don't know whether that makes sense in terms of...
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. And I think on this note, we're out of time. I want to thank Professor Korieh for such an incisive section, and also the Center for Memories. Can we once more celebrate Professor Korieh for this wonderful lecture? Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you so much for an insightful lecture, and to CEO for seamlessly driving the conversation. And in the tradition of the center, I'd like to call the executive director of the Opu Leadership Foundation to come and make a presentation to our amiable moderator this evening. I think Katu maybe. Mr.
Well, good evening, Prof. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I was asked to make a presentation, but before I do that, I wanted a question. So, and this is an opportunity to ask that question. I hope I'm not taking you. My question is, an Igbo man is a Republican by nature, but I discovered immediately he's given a position, or either in government or whatever, he shrinks. It's just like what you said about what happened in university. Assuming if you are appointed a vice chancellor of University of Nigeria, and I want to come and host this Biafran issue, will you tolerate it? Well, it can be a question for another day. But on behalf of Center for Memory, I hope I'm doing this. Okay. To the CEO, Ephraim Ekenwa, who have done marvelous job in moderating this this evening, and I think he has done his best, and I believe that his best was good enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the Center for Memories. Thank you. Okay, yes.
After the pictures, I would like to invite Chief Ben Etiaba to make a presentation to the speaker for today's session, and also to give a vote of thanks for today's event. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ehai, the Executive Director of the Center. Once again, I've been asked on behalf of the leadership of the Center for Memories to appreciate the distinguished lecturer for this month, who has spoken so wonderfully on Igbo Gadi, reclaiming the Igbo blueprint in the cultural and political evolution of sub-Saharan Africa. But before I give him the plaque, which is the main presentation, there's a token from the center, and it's my privilege to hand that over to you, Prof. Okay, but the main presentation, I hope we haven't run out of films. You're probably, I'm not trying to be condescending, probably too young to recall or to remember when we used to have films that were developed. So you might be trying to take the all-important picture and then you run out of films. That doesn't happen anymore because of the advancement in technology. Mazi Chima Korieh, Dalu, Professor of History and African Diaspora Studies, Dalu. You know, it's been an honor to be in the audience, to listen to you speak about Ndị Igbo as a people. Makana onye amaro ebe mmiri na ọmabịa adama ebe ọ ga-anọ kwụsị ya. And learn about to be able to understand why you are where you are, and to be able to shape the future. And if you don't tell your story, others will tell that story for you. And what you will hear from others may not be what you may want to hear. So with this, I say today being Friday, the 6th of June, 2025. Today being Friday, the 6th of June, 2025, a presentation, a plaque, to commemorate today for you, to commemorate a great lecture. Congratulations, Prof. Thank you. And this said, I've also been asked to give the vote of thanks. And it's my privilege to say thank you to Prof, as I've said already. But this is Ńkàtá Ụmụ-Ìgbò. And if you had such a wonderful lecture without an audience, it wouldn't have been Ńkàtá. If you've had such a wonderful lecture without the interactive session, it wouldn't have been Ńkàtá. What makes it Ńkàtá is the audience participation, as was piloted by the CEO himself so well. It is the audience that is very, very key and very important to this evening. I may not want to name everybody one by one. We all know that all of us are VIPs, all of us are important. Nobody in this audience is more important than the other. But please permit me to acknowledge and recognize the presence of Dr. Patrick Chukwu, former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. We already saw Dr. Daniel Okwu when he made his presentation and asked a rhetoric question. Architect I saw him earlier, Obuju Ogugu. I think he's somewhere there in the audience. And of course, the prolific broadcaster, Uche Gabriel. Thank you for a wonderful month. But I want to remind all of us about the Things Fall Apart Festival starting at the end of this month. This is why the center is in existence. Please try and spread the word to the world that this festival is holding, because we want it to be a massive success. And of course, we know that with the anticipated presence of Chimamanda Adichie, that people will want to be a part of it and identify with it. But we want to use this festival to grow the followership globally of this great center. Dalunu. And it is now time to call for pictures. So if I may ask for all of us to come to the front to take a picture, a group photograph with the distinguished lecturer and the leadership of the center. But once again, can we put our hands together for this distinguished?